Hello everybody. On Patreon, I have a $2 reward tier where people can ask me questions about a video that's just been released. I've collected 18 of them on the Furries episode, and I'm going to be going down and answering each of them. First off, Zachary Maynard asks, are there any archives of the old funny animal comics? I've never heard of those before this video. It would be terrible if they were lost media. I have good news for you then. There are some really big archives of some of this stuff. Obviously not everything is saved, and it's a little bit patchy, but there are two really big places that you can go to find this old stuff. The first is furrytimes.net/downloads. I'll have the links to this, by the way, in the description. That has a ton of old zines, like I mean well over 100. And then there's also conference.com. I believe that Mark Merlino is the one who keeps that thing going. He has a ton of old media about not just old conference stuff, not just old fanzines, but also archived convention material and pamphlets. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, definitely go check out those two resources, furrytimes.net/downloads and conference.com. They are treasure troves, and I use them extensively. The second question comes from Elvis Delaney. Were you worried about getting backlash for treating the subject of furries so seriously, considering a major part of their history is people's derision and often outright hostility towards them? Yes. Which is why I approached the video from such a factual standpoint. In some of my videos, like in the Christian video or the DSP video, I will provide some very limited qualitative assessments. For the Furries video, I avoided doing that at all, as much as I could. It's also one of the reasons why I didn't go into a lot of the later stuff, because there's so much stuff, and the only way to really cover it well would be to oversimplify it. To keep it under an hour, or more like 2 hours. So yes, it was very much a concern when I was crafting the script. The third question comes from James Huggett. The video was brilliant and informative as a history of furries. I'm glad. What I missed was a real analysis of why this weird, bizarre thing suddenly became so popular. The conclusion, one thing is clear, furries are here to stay, is a hollow and meaningless cliche, which I found rather disappointing. That's a fair criticism. So like I mentioned in the reply to Elvis, I was really trying to stay out of any sort of analysis. That's generally what I do in my videos. I try to keep from doing too much analysis and instead provide the information that I can to allow my viewers to perform the analysis for themselves and form their own opinions. I do agree that the cliche is bad. It's kind of a pattern that I started doing after a while, and I should probably get rid of, so thank you for pointing that out. Question 4 comes from Michelle Arkham. This topic seems so vast and daunting to tackle. How did you even begin the research process? So, I suspected correctly that there were a ton of people who had already tried to do an analysis on, or a historical documentation on furries. I dug into those, I found where they were lacking, and I said, okay, no, there has to be something that came before this. They talked about, Mark Merlino and Steve Galacci, but they didn't really talk much about funny animals. As soon as I found that keyword, I found, it was as easy as a Google search to find some of the old stuff. Things like Voodoo were definitely talked about earlier on, but the progenitors weren't really talked about. I had to dig a little bit further into what funny animals were and how they manifested, because obviously if there was a fandom around them, there had to have been something before that, right? So that's really where I started, and I just carried on from there. Question 5 comes from Soj King Vinesmoke. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. How many funny animal comics did you have to sift through over the course of the research for this video, and which were the most and least interesting? So, there were a lot. I sifted through dozens, and I began to see a couple of similar names sometimes. I would often just go to the earliest one in a series that I could find. As for the most and least interesting, what I was really interested in was there was a funny animal zine targeting specifically fans of centaurs, which is really weird to me because the funny animal fandom was already extremely specific. For there to be a subset for centaurs fascinated me. As for the most boring, there were a ton that were just done by complete amateurs who, bought those old how to draw manga books and they were filled with a lot of those. There wasn't a whole lot of funny animal material artists at the time, so they kind of had to go with what they had, and sometimes the result wasn't terribly interesting or good. Amusing in its own way, though. Question 6 comes from Talons of Ice and Fire. They ask, what is your opinion on the burned furs, their founders, and their rhetoric? As much as I hate to admit it, I can't help but feel a little bit of sympathy for them, despite the extreme and sometimes insane beliefs of some of its members. Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way. So, I try not to talk about my opinions too much, but I will say that I empathize a lot with the burned furs. They were very worried about their public perception. I think that they felt that their rhetoric was aggressive. As they mentioned before, for some time they've been pushing at the furry community to say, hey, no, bestiality is bad, and there was a pushback saying, like, we're not even going to address this, and that frustrated a lot of people. And they wanted to outright address it before people from the outside came in. There were already news outlets talking about them and this sort of weird stuff, and they were saying, oh yeah, all furries are bestialous, if that's the right word, which is obviously untrue, and they wanted to stop that from being a rumor that was disseminated through popular culture. The problem was, like, they felt that was necessary, but the rhetoric was so aggressive that it created a backlash, and they started attacking certain small parts of what the burned furs were saying and using that as an excuse to dismiss all of it a lot of the time. I can't speak to how actually anti-homophobic the movement in general was. I couldn't find a lot of evidence for it on the Usenet boards. It may have been more personal in general, but mostly I just found people claiming it. There definitely were a couple of anti-homosexual people within the fandom that kind of got driven out. And it really was, the reason I went over it for so long was because it really was a defining moment. It defined furry culture and how tolerant they were. They chose tolerance, so they essentially made it into a binary of tolerance and intolerance. And they chose tolerance and all of the good and bad that brings. So hopefully I kind of answered your question. I think I did. Question 7 comes from Arkaxon. In case you guys don't know, Arkaxon is the graphic designer who's been doing graphic design since the chronological Final Fantasy House video, and he's great. He asks, this thing was huge and we know you had so much that needed to be cut out. Do you plan in the future to ever make a follow-up video? I really want to. But if I were to, I would want to do it in a more traditional documentary style where I go out and do interviews and record conventions and go to the houses of artists and talk to them about their work, maybe even do online interviews if I can't get out to actually visit the people. Maybe, like, I've been kind of throwing around the idea of occasionally doing Kickstarters so I can get plane tickets, but if I were to cover the furry community again, it would look like that. I want to cover the more modern stuff, because I was really going for everything, like, before the internet completely fractured it. And so it would take a lot more effort, I think, and a lot wider scope in order to cover the modern furry fandom. Question 8 comes from Axel and Wheel. What would you call the defining moment of the fandom, the point where it became a subculture beyond a fandom? I would put that at Conference 1, because that's the point where you see its own homogenous economy beginning to appear. You have people bringing their money from outside the fandom and spending it within it, and then that money begins circulating within it. And as more money gets plugged in, you have more people coming in, but the start of it was Conference 1. The reason being, they were emulating other kinds of conventions, specifically science fiction conventions, which were often defined by their art shows. You have a lot of art being sold at those places, so they were like, okay, let's do that, because a lot of the people attending the furry conventions came out of the science fiction and anime fandoms, where that was really common. So that's where I'd say, if I had to put a line somewhere. Question 9 comes from Anthony. What do you think set apart the furry fandom from other groups and subcultures with regards to how they developed such a big internet presence, just as the internet was beginning to become mainstream, and how said presence has managed to endure for so long? In general, they have a working pattern of becoming among the earliest adopters of so many types of websites and technologies related to the internet, so why do you think this is? So the furry community has a disproportionate number of tech enthusiasts. This goes all the way back to science fiction conventions and nerd culture in the 80s. It's because, like I mentioned in the question before this from Axel and Wheel, furry fandom came directly, the furry conventions especially, came out of science fiction and anime conventions, and a lot of those people involved there were geeks, and they expanded their interest by digging into modern technology, especially computing technology. And so because so many of the furries came from there, they had some knowledge already of these systems, and generally they would reach out and spread in those communities. So the people who knew about furries and were interested in furries and got plugged into the community were already tech geeks in one form or another. And so, because of that, and they were also artists a lot of the time, so they would be privy to new technology as it was coming out, and they'd be using it, and then because they were so powerful and useful, people in the furry community would begin using them. And then even the people who weren't so tech savvy would hear about it and learn about it and start using it. That's my theory. It makes sense to me. I hope I'm right. I don't have a whole lot of extra research to back that up, but it would make a lot of sense. Question 10 comes from Kelly Burke. The video's focus on mostly the history of furry culture was very thorough and elucidating. Can you talk briefly about where the furry culture stands today with regard to convention participation, public perception, and if any acrimony from the burned fur period remains or is manifested in a different form? Thank you for all your hard work. It's my pleasure. I'm glad you're enjoying it so much. The current culture is really weird in that it's so splintered. You have a lot of people that go to conventions, but I do not have demographics, but I want to say that a majority of furries do not attend conventions. I think that there are a lot of stereotypes around furries based on convention participation, but the people who attend conventions tend to be people who are involved in a very specific part of the fandom, not necessarily the largest. For example, there was a survey done of people at a convention, and I think it said that 1/3 of the people there had fursuits in one form or another, and I know that not nearly that many furries actually own fursuits or go fursuiting. So obviously the demographics are a little bit warped in terms of what people perceive. As for the burned furs and their legacy, the reason that I dedicated so much time to them is because the questions that they raised are still very present in the fandom today and are very defining for a lot of people. You have people saying, like, I'm furry, but there's no way I'm getting into this part of it, or I disagree heavily with this part of it. So that's a conversation that's still going on today. And often very heated. You can see it, like, right now, there's a lot of contest around depicting sexual children, like sexual furry children, and whether or not the fact that it's visual art rather than photography makes it pedophilic art. There's a ton of controversy around it. A consensus has kind of been reached, I think, that it's not okay, but you still have pockets. And like I said, the furry community is very fractured, so you have different groups thinking different things. But it continues to today, and I doubt it will ever stop. So Kelly had a second question. So FYI, I didn't bring it up before. I didn't make it super clear, I don't think, but I just want one question each time from each person. But I'll let it slide this time. And Kelly asks, do you think subcultures that grow on the fringe of the mainstream, be it a fetish, fandom, or any other subject that attracts like-minded individuals, will inevitably succumb to gatekeeping, tribalism, and infighting as it did in the furry community? I mean, it's happened since the beginning of time. It'll keep happening. I highly doubt that it will ever stop. Question 12 comes from JoJo's Dogtail. At conventions or at all in the community, do people in furry costumes choose to eat food that their portrayed animal would eat? I want to know how immersed some become while inside their costume. I did not do a ton of digging into those people that dig into their whatever animal they identify with. It's sort of in the otherkin spectrum and I think is pretty fringe even by furry standards. As for people in fursuits at conventions, there's generally a rule where they do not take off their headpiece, they do not take off their costume until they are in a private place, and they do not eat, and sometimes they drink while they're in it if they're very clever about it, but for the most part, they don't consume anything while they're in their suits, I don't believe. Question 13 comes from Raphael Bishop. As a furry yourself, how did you get into the furry community, and how did the media depictions of furries affect you becoming one? So I'm not really a furry. I mentioned this on Twitter. I'm more furry adjacent. A lot of my really close friends are furries, though. Quite a few of them. And so I just kind of end up collecting a lot of information on it by osmosis. I'm sorry if that's kind of an inadequate... like, I don't know if you feel like you asked the wrong question, but essentially there definitely is a concern about, like, public perception around them, and I'm really surprised and I'm impressed for the people that have the balls to just outright say, yeah, I'm a furry. Fuck you. Question 14 comes from Slim Steven. Would you ever want to go to a furry convention? Funny thing that... I got invited by Nick Nocturne and Cocodope to come speak at a furry convention. They're two of my really close buddies at this point. Nick especially, he and I have gotten really close. He's the person who runs Nightmind, for those who don't know. He is a very outward furry, and has a lot of fun with it. And they wanted me to come and speak similarly to the way that I did at Too Many Games. So I'm gonna be going. I will try to take photographs. I'm really bad at doing so, but I'm fascinated about the dynamic at those things because they're really unique in a lot of ways, compared to nerd conventions, and I want to see what the dynamic is like there. So I'm excited. I'll maybe post about it and some interesting things I found on Patreon if you guys are interested. Question 15 comes from Great Nocturne 357. Been waiting for this one, and I gotta say it's not bad. A lot of the beginnings than what I'd like, but still glad with the finished product. I think they meant they wanted me to cover more of the late furry fandom. Now for the question. What made you become a furry, and if not one already, what would you say in your opinion would have been the thing to make you one? Or, what is your thoughts on Therian, the furries who believe they are animals? I kind of already addressed the first one, so I'll answer the second. Therian, to me, remind me a lot of Otherkin. I'm sure that there are some furries that are going to be unhappy with me saying this and calling me intolerant. I see them a lot as Otherkin in the sense that, like, they're trying to be good people or looking for an identity, but they're adding extra steps to it. I personally think it's a little silly, but that's just me. Question 16 comes from Dreams Epilogue. Collect any cool art? The old funny animal style really isn't my thing. I like the super rounded edges and the sort of, like, I enjoy the Disney movies, of course, sure, but the style itself is not super duper appealing in the way that, like, some of the modern art is appealing to me, the modern furry stuff, because there's some cool stuff that goes on, especially nowadays. So, I mean, I have some collected, obviously, on my hard drive for the video itself. Some stuff that I didn't use. Most of it is just curiosities. Question 17 comes from Adam D. Goff. What's your spirit animal or fursona? So, funny thing that, I thought that making a fursona was one of the most interesting parts of the furry fandom. It really took off in the early 2000s. I think that the whole concept of picking an animal that you think personifies yourself, or maybe has traits that you aspire to, and making a persona or a character based on it was really cool. It could be useful in a lot of ways, especially, like, the bit of it that interested me the most was self-reflection. So I contacted an artist that made fan art for me a while ago and got him to help me make a fursona. I commissioned him. We chose a whale shark, and it was a lot of fun. I posted it on Twitter a little while ago, and then people started making fan art for him, which was, like, crazy and really sweet. And some of the stuff that people made was actually, all of it was really, really cool. It's exciting. It's definitely an interesting process. I had to start asking myself, like, what do I want it to be? Do I want it to just be me, or do I want it to be like traits that I aspire to? So I kind of made him more as a reminder to be to me, to embody the traits that I value the most. And so I think he turned out okay. I think he's super cute. Question 18 comes from Rasmus Degen. I really hope I'm pronouncing this right. This is a meta question, but are there going to be Q&A videos for subjects covered before these Q&A videos were a thing? If you guys would like it, absolutely. We could start with digital homicide and work our way forward from there if you all would be interested. If you are, and you're a patron, or you're a potential patron, and would be interested in that, let me know in the comments, or comment on the post on this on Patreon, because I'm totally for it. Hey, thanks everyone for listening to this. I hope it was interesting to you at all. I tried to stay mostly on topic and to keep it nice and condensed. I think it's still going to be a little bit long. But thank you all very much. I will see you all later.